The truck had been sinking since 4 in the morning. Not dramatically, not the sudden catastrophic disappearance that people imagine when they hear the word bog. Slowly, with the particular patience of soft ground that has been accumulating centuries of decomposed forest matter and waiting for something heavy enough to demonstrate what it is capable of. A timber hauler, a 12-ton boosing loaded with freshly felled spruce trunks, bound for the sawmill at Grafenau, had come off the forest track at the turn behind the third stand of old-growth pine and found, in the darkness before the winter dawn, that the section of ground it was crossing was not ground at all but a layer of compressed sphagnum moss and root mat over 2 meters of wet peat, and that the weight of 12 tons of truck and timber was not something this layer had been designed to accommodate. The right rear axle went first. The driver had felt it through the wheel before the headlights showed him anything, a soft, yielding sensation that had no equivalent on firm ground, the specific feeling of a surface that is accepting your weight in a way that means it intends to keep it. He had accelerated, which was the wrong decision, but was also the only instinct available at 4 in the morning in a dark Bavarian forest, and the acceleration had given the left rear axle the same opportunity, and within 40 seconds the entire rear section of the truck was below the level of the forest floor and sinking. He had cut the engine and climbed out through the cab window onto the front axle, which was still on the track, and sat there in the dark and the cold, and listened to the forest and waited for it to become light enough to understand what had happened. By the time the foreman arrived at 7, the rear of the truck was submerged to the top of the rear wheel arches in dark bog water. The spruce trunks had shifted in their chains and were lying at an angle that made recovery geometry complicated. The forest road behind the truck was usable. The forest on either side of the road at this point was bog for at least 40 meters in every direction. The foreman's name was Gerhard Wolf. He was 36 years old, had been running timber operations in the Bavarian forest for the Grafenau Timber Company since 1957, and had pulled 4 trucks out of difficult situations in that time with the company's heavy winch vehicle and a steel cable and enough patience. He walked the bog edge twice, looked at the truck, thought about angles and anchor points, and the weight of 12 tons of timber plus the suction that the peat would have developed around the rear axle in the 3 hours since the truck went in. He made a call to the company depot. The winch vehicle was on the road by 8. By noon, he had stopped the winch operation. If this is your first story on this channel, subscribe now and hit the bell. New story every single day. Let me tell you about the Grafenau bog and about what peat does to vehicles that enter it, because the physics of the problem is where this story begins. The Bayerischer Wald, the Bavarian forest, is old country. The mountains are not dramatic in the way of the Alps to the south, but they are dense, and the valleys between them hold water in the specific way of forest terrain that has been accumulating organic matter since before any human memory of it. Bogs form where drainage is poor and the water table is permanent, where sphagnum moss builds up over centuries into layers that look, from the surface, like ordinary forest floor, dark, springy, covered with the same low vegetation as the ground on either side. The difference is invisible until weight is applied to it. When weight is applied to a bog surface, what happens depends on the weight and the area over which it is distributed. A person crosses a bog safely because their weight per square foot is low enough that the compressed surface vegetation holds. A horse pulling a light cart can cross a bog if it moves steadily, because the mat of roots and compressed moss redistributes the load laterally before it can sink through. A modern timber hauler with 12 tons concentrated on 4 contact patches, each the size of a dinner table, does not cross a bog, it enters it. The suction created when a large vehicle sinks into wet peat is one of the more unpleasant engineering problems in forestry work. As the vehicle sinks, the peat fills in around the axles and creates a seal. The vehicle is no longer simply sitting on soft ground. It is now encased. To pull it out, You must not only overcome the weight but the suction, the vacuum that the peat maintains around every surface it has surrounded. In practice, this adds 40 to 60% to the effective recovery load, depending on depth and time in the ground. The Grafenau Company's winch vehicle had a rated pull of 14 tons. The timber hauler with its load was 12 tons in normal conditions. With suction factored in, the effective resistance was over 18 tons, and the only anchor available was a large pine tree 70 meters from the truck, which gave a pull angle that was 30 degrees wrong, and which had provided the wrong direction of force precisely at the moment when the suction seal was most important to break. The cable had parted at 11:45. Nobody had been hurt. Wolf had stood at the bog edge for some time looking at the cable and looking at the truck and making his assessment. And his assessment was that the situation required either more equipment than he had available in the Grafenau district or a different approach than he was currently considering. He was trying to think of what a different approach might look like when Heinrich Leitner came out of the trees. Heinrich Leitner was 62 years old, and he had lived at the farm on the forest margin 2 kilometers northeast of this bog since 1937. His family had been in the Grafenau forest since his grandfather had arrived from Austria in 1891 to work on the first large-scale timber operation in the valley, and had stayed when the operation moved on and built a farm on the cleared land at the forest edge. In 62 years of living beside this particular section of the Bayerischer Wald, Heinrich had learned things about it that were not written down anywhere and would not survive him if he chose not to tell them. He knew which sections of the forest floor were safe in spring and which were dangerous. He knew where the old drainage channels from the 1890s forestry operation ran, now invisible under 7 decades of vegetation. He knew the bog by its edges and its center and its deepest points, and he knew, because his grandfather had told his father and his father had told him, about the Neupel Dam. The Neupel Dam was a corduroy road. It had been built in 1923 by a forestry team working a stand of timber on the far side of the bog, who had needed a way to get their horse-drawn timber sledges across the wet ground. They had laid it in the old way, 2 parallel lines of small-diameter logs, laid transversely across the bog surface, with a layer of brushwood tamped down between them, running from the firm forest road on the near side to the firm ground of the timber stand on the far. It had been built for the weight of horses and loaded sledges. When the operation was complete, the corduroy road had been left in place. There was no reason to remove it, and removing logs from a bog is considerably harder than leaving them where they are. By 1963, 40 years of peat accumulation had covered the Neupel Dam completely. There was no surface indication of where it was or that it had ever existed. Heinrich Leitner knew where it was. His father had walked him along it in 1936 and shown him the specific trees that marked its endpoints. The trees were still there. The road was still there under 40 centimeters of peat, and the logs, old-growth spruce from the 1923 cut, properly debarked and dried before laying, were still bearing load. His grandfather had said, "A properly laid Neupel Dam will hold horse weight for 100 years." He also knew that from the Neupel Dam's end point on the far side of the bog, the angle to the stuck truck's front axle was almost precisely the correct angle for a straight pull, a line that would break the peat suction seal by lifting the front while pulling forward, which was how you extracted a vehicle from a peat bog if you understood the geometry. He had worked through this in his head while walking from the farm. He came out of the trees carrying the starting crank for the Lanz in one hand, which he had brought because the morning was cold, and he had been starting the engine at home to let it warm while he walked. Wolf looked at him. He looked at the crank. He looked at the direction Heinrich had come from, which was, as far as he could tell, directly across the bog. "There is a Neupel Dam," Heinrich said. 1923, 2 log lines, brushwood fill. It runs from the stand of birch at the northeast corner to a point approximately 15 meters from where the front axle is now. He looked at the truck. From that point, the pull angle is direct to the front axle. The suction will break first on the underside when the front comes up. Wolf looked at the bog. "That is 40 meters of bog," he said. "The Neupel Dam is there," Heinrich said. "It will hold the Lanz. The Lanz is not heavy enough to fail it." "How do you know the road is still intact? It has been 40 years. "Because my father walked it in 1958 to confirm it was still there. Old-growth spruce in a wet environment does not rot quickly. The wood is saturated. It is preserved." He looked at Wolf. He was satisfied it would hold for another 30 years. Wolf was quiet. One of the logging crew, a younger man, standing near the broken cable, said something to the man beside him. Both of them looked toward the bog and then at each other with the expression of men who have made an assessment and are not keeping it to themselves. Wolf looked at Heinrich Leitner. "How long?" he said. "The bog crossing is the slow part, an hour to position, then the pull." He looked at the truck. "Less than 2 hours." "All right," Wolf said. Let me tell you what Heinrich Leitner understood about bog recovery, that Wolf's 12 years of forestry work had not prepared him to know. Recovering a vehicle from a peat bog requires 3 things to align: a firm approach to the vehicle, a correct pull angle to break the suction seal, and a pulling force that is steady rather than shock-loaded. Wolf had failed on all 3. His winch vehicle could not reach the truck because it was too heavy to stay on the bog surface. His pull angle from the tree anchor was wrong, and his winch, when it came under maximum load, had applied its force in the specific way of modern high-powered machines, with a surge that had snapped the cable at the moment of maximum resistance rather than the gradual, steady pull that bog suction responds to. The Lanz Bulldog's contribution was threefold. First, it was light enough for the Neupel Dam. At 2,200 kilograms, it distributed its weight across the buried log surface without exceeding the load rating that 1923 old-growth spruce had been carrying in compressed wet conditions for 4 decades. The logging crew's winch vehicle weighed 9,000 kilograms. Second, from the Neupel Dam's endpoint, the angle to the truck's front axle was correct. The specific upward-forward line that would lift the front of the truck as it pulled forward, creating the pressure differential that would begin to break the peat seal on the rear axle from below. Third, the Lanz's flywheel. When bog suction resists a pull, it resists non-linearly building as the vehicle begins to move, peaking at the moment the seal begins to break, then dropping suddenly as the peat releases. A modern high-powered winch surges at the peak. When the resistance peaks at the seal breaking moment, the force peaks with it and something breaks. The Lanz's single-cylinder flywheel engine provided steady, continuous pull that built gradually and maintained itself through the peak without surging. It could not surge if it tried. It fired once per second and stored the energy in 80 kilograms of spinning iron and released it smoothly. Heinrich had not thought through any of this explicitly. He had recovered 2 farm vehicles from this bog in 30 years using the Lanz and the Neupel Dam and the same approach angle, and both times it had worked. He knew it worked the way he knew everything that worked, because it had worked in the specific place with the specific machine. Subscribe now if you have not, because what happens on the Grafenau bog in the next 2 hours is the reason the Bayerischer Wald still tells this story. He set fire to the Lanz at the bog edge. This was how it was described by the logging crew afterward, that he set fire to it, because they had not seen a glue cup started before, and the blowtorch applied to the cast-iron dome at the base of the engine looked, from 50 meters across a bog in early winter, exactly like a man who had decided the way to solve the situation was to light his tractor on fire. The blue-orange flame. The cast iron beginning to glow. One of the younger crew members had started walking toward Heinrich before the man next to him had explained what he was watching. 10 minutes. The cast iron hot bulb chamber absorbed the heat against the cold of the forest morning. Heinrich held the torch steady and waited. He had learned this from his father. In cold conditions, Add 4 minutes to whatever you think is enough. The iron remembers cold longer than you do. 10 minutes, the color arrived. He set the torch aside. He inserted the starting crank. He turned it once. The flywheel moved. He turned it again, his full weight in the rotation. On the third turn, the engine fired. Pum! The sound went into the forest. The trees gave it back, changed, as forests change everything that enters them. Pum! 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 1 beat per second in a Bavarian forest on a cold November morning. The exhaust pipe sent its dark smoke into the gray forest air. The logging crew watched. Nobody spoke. Heinrich climbed onto the open seat and drove the Lanz to the start of the Neupel Dam. He found the entry point the way his father had showed him, 4 paces right of the largest birch at the northeast corner, looking for the slight linear depression that the Neupel Dam made, visible only if you knew it was there. He tested the surface at 3 points with a steel rod, pressing down until he felt the solid resistance of the buried logs. The logs were there. He climbed back on. Hit subscribe and the bell. New story every single day. Stay with this. Pum pum pum. The Lanz moved onto the bog. The surface vegetation compressed under the tires, softer than firm ground, with a slight give, but the compression did not continue. The logs beneath, 40 centimeters down, held. The Lanz moved at its field road pace, and the bog accepted it the way the bog accepted horses, with reluctant tolerance based on a calculation about weight per square meter that came out correctly. The logging crew on the far side were watching. They had gone quiet in the way of men watching something that has no precedent in their experience. At 20 meters, the surface was softer. The logs were still there. Heinrich could feel them through the machine, the specific solidity of buried timber transmitting itself up through the tires and the frame to the seat. At 30 meters, dark bog water was visible between the compressed moss around the tires. The tires were at the bog level. The Neupel Dam was all that was between the Lanz and the peat below. Heinrich did not look at the water. He looked at the line ahead and at the tree on the far side that marked the endpoint. Pum pum pum. 40 meters. The end of the Neupel Dam was under the front tires. He stopped. He was 15 meters from the truck's front axle. He climbed down into the bog edge, his rubber boots going into the knee, and waded to the truck's front axle. He attached the winch cable. He tested the connection. He waded back. He climbed on. He engaged the winch drum. Pum pum pum. The cable came taut. The flywheel turned. The bog did not move. For 30 seconds the bog held everything still, the truck, the peat, the pole, with the absolute resistance of 2 meters of wet peat and 8 hours of accumulated suction. The engine dropped perhaps 30 RPM. The exhaust smoke thickened. The flywheel turned. Pum pum pum. Then a sound from the bog around the rear axle. Not a crack, not a splash. Something between a deep, yielding exhalation. The peat releasing its grip on the lower surface of the rear axle as the front axle began to lift. The truck moved forward 3 centimeters, then 8. Then the rear axle began to come up. Heinrich held the throttle. The flywheel held the pull. The bog released the truck in the specific way a bog releases anything that is correctly extracted, not all at once, but in stages, each stage requiring the same steady force as the previous, the peat surrendering section by section from the bottom up. At 90 seconds, the rear wheels broke the surface. At 2 minutes, the truck's full weight was back on its tires, and the Lanz was pulling it toward firm ground. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the truck was on the forest road. Pum pum pum. The Lanz drove back across the Neupel Dam. Heinrich did not look at the dark water beside him. He looked at the line ahead and felt the buried timber under his tires and trusted it, as his father had trusted it, as his grandfather's generation had laid it and walked away knowing it would hold. It held. Wolf came to him at the bog edge when the truck had been confirmed undamaged. Leitner, he said. Heinrich was coiling the winch cable. The road under the bog, 1923, your grandfather built it. He helped build it, Heinrich said. He told my father where it was and my father told me. He looked at the bog. It was laid for horses. The Lanz is within that weight range if driven carefully. Wolf said, my cable pulled 18 tons and broke. Your tractor pulled the same truck out with a fraction of the force. Different angle, Heinrich said, and steady pull. The peat suction does not break with shock load. It breaks when the upward component of the force exceeds the seal pressure gradually. The angle from the Neupel Dam endpoint gives that. Your anchor did not. Wolf was quiet for a long time. How many people know about the Neupel Dam? He said. My son, Heinrich said. I showed him in 1954. He is in Munich now and does not come to the forest. Then after you, Wolf said, nobody. Heinrich said, that is why I am telling you now. He looked at the bog. The endpoint on this side is 4 paces right of the large birch at the northeast corner. Surface shows a slight linear depression if you know to look. The logs are 40 centimeters down and will hold horse weight. That is what matters. He climbed onto the Lanz and drove into the trees. Pum pum pum. Wolf wrote the location of the Neupel Dam in his forestry notebook that evening. The northeast birch, 4 paces right, linear depression, 40 centimeters to timber, horse weight rating. He showed it to the district forestry office the following week and suggested that old corduroy roads be included in the bog inventory. The suggestion was noted. No inventory was conducted. Heinrich Leitner farmed the forest margin until 1974. The Lanz Bulldog remained on the farm. His son came back from Munich twice, once for the funeral, once for the estate settlement. He sold the farm. He sold the equipment. He did not look in the forestry notebook on the kitchen shelf where his father had written down in 1963 the location of the Neupel Dam and what it would hold. The notebook went to the Grafenau second-hand market in the spring of 1975. The Neupel Dam is still there. The old-growth spruce has been in the wet peat since 1923. It will be there long after the last person who knew about it is gone. The bog will wait. Pum pum pum. Some knowledge is not written down because the people who have it do not think it needs to be, because they know it completely, and in knowing it completely they forget that it is not common. What lives in one man's memory and nowhere else is one death away from being lost entirely. The Neupel Dam at the northeast corner of the Grafenau bog survived because a grandfather told a father and a father told a son, and the son told a forestry foreman who wrote it in a notebook. Whether the chain held beyond that point, nobody can say. Old iron found the bog road that modern equipment could not use. Old knowledge found the angle that modern engineering had missed. Some things persist in the ground long after the world above them has moved on. The bog knows. Pum pum pum.